In a moment, Rae Armantrout will give a talk titled Trendspotting, Poetry's New Thing, which I believe will respond to a Stephen Burt essay from last year called The New Thing. In his essay, Burt figures Armantrout as centrally representative of a current trend in poetry. Poets that express fidelity to the material and social world. The world that we have, he says, is the world that we are. At 5 p.m. in the Leatherby Libraries in the Henley Room, she will give a poetry reading. At the back of the room, a whole bunch of books are there, if you happen not to have copies of her work. And I think some of the other poets that will come later in the fall, their books are there as well. The Fall Poetry Series is a Tabula Poetica event. And we offer grateful acknowledgement for their support to Chapman's English Department and to Poets and Writers, the James Irvine Foundation. If I were to be long-winded in my introduction of Rae Armantrout, I might talk for longer than she will. I had better be brief. She might talk for 5, maybe 6 minutes, and even if she has a lot to say this afternoon, it takes 10 minutes or more than that, we had better listen carefully to all of it. In her essays and poems, she delights her readers with an unmistakable wit and precise turns of thought, turns that take us inward, making us aware of that which we think, even without our thinking that we think it. And going inward, surprise, takes us out. That dream we had is really a movie we watched last week, which was once a dream, which was once a movie, which was once a lover scratching words on the scalp of her beloved. That panini we had for lunch was once a painting of a jelly donut. Her poet's desire is, quote, to spin around suddenly and catch the world unaware, in dishevelment, to see it as it is when we're not looking. Her words can and do spin suddenly, even when she ends up catching, to use as she does the words of the poet Lorene Niedecker, what she catches is the power of breathing while we sleep, and the parts of the body that move without sound. Listen carefully, because even though Armantrout has openly acknowledged her influences, the older ones, Emily Dickinson and William Carlos Williams, and calls out to those in her present company like Ron Silliman, Carla Harriman, and other language poets, as she has said, if this is my school, I played hooky a lot. Rae Armantrout has an inimitable voice. There is no one like her, which is deeply curious because she has long been preoccupied with mimicry, ventriloquy, backtalk, small talk, dream talk, media babble. In other words, to be a poet and have your own voice, listen carefully to the voices around you and in you. She lets them speak. She has them speak out. She rejects the notion that people and things exist, quote, as ready to be pressed into the service of metaphor. An inimitable voice is one that does not need others to repeat what she has written in order to feel that her words matter. They matter because if you listen carefully, you will hear yourself talking. Rae Armantrout's first book was Extremities in 1978, and more recently, between 2001 and 2009, she has published 4 books: The Pretext, Up to Speed, Next Life, and Versed, which this year was not only a finalist for the National Book Award, it won the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Pulitzer Prize. This is very sweet applause for a poet who, for many years, was beloved and admired as a poet's poet and one of the truest minds in the scene. She is also a true Southern California native, lives in San Diego, where she teaches at UCSD. Please join me in welcoming Rae Armantrout to Chapman.
Thank you, Logan. That was very nice. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm probably going to speak longer than 10 minutes. I hope so, but but also we can have questions maybe afterwards. I passed around a handout, and it's going to make a lot more sense if you can see the handout. If you didn't get one, because I brought 30 copies, I don't know how, I'm bad at guessing how many of you there are, but if you don't have one, try to share one with someone. I'm going to talk for a little while first and then start referring to the handout. So I'm going to tell you about myself, of course, indirectly by talking first about some tendencies or movements in poetry that I have a connection with or feel a connection with. The young, well, he seems young to me, critic Stephen Burt, who might be called a trend spotter, recently, a year ago, published an essay in the Boston Review identifying what he saw as a new trend, or as he put it, the new thing in poetry. He identified a group of youngish poets, people now in their 30s, turning away from the slippery, oblique, not to say nebulous, sometimes playful, effusive style of their immediate predecessors to write spare, often short, unadorned, outward-looking, and these are mainly his words, poems. Of course, as is so often the case, this new thing, which Ron Cinnamon referred to on his influential blog as the new precisionism, is in fact a bit retro. It might, perhaps, be called neo-imagism. It sounds like I'm being critical, but actually I like these new poets, and I'm glad to see this tendency reassert itself. I feel close to it. I started out, at least, as a kind of neo-minimalist myself. And in fact, Burt identifies me as a possible mother to this poetic breed. William Carlos Williams or George Oppen, he says, might have been the father, though I swear I don't remember that. But things were hazy back then. So it's time to name names. Who were or are these poets of the oblique and slippery, whom Burt referred to in a previous essay some 12 years ago, approximately, as the elliptical poets? And who are these poets of the new thing he is writing about today? He likes to make lists. He has his lists and I have mine. They overlap, but they aren't exactly the same. Among the elliptical poets he mentions, well, he says that Jory Graham and John Ashbery, he always likes to pose some non-couple as the progenitors of his movement. So he says that John Ashbery and Jory Graham are perhaps the mother and father of the elliptical poets, who might include such writers as Mattia Harvey, Angie Malenko, or is it Angie Malenko? I've never known. Mark Levine. I myself wonder whether poets like Peter Gizzi and Elizabeth Robinson might not also fit into that category. And in fact, there are a lot of others that I could name. But classification is always a tricky and thankless task. It might be easier to say who these new precisionists are. Burt mentions Joseph Massey, Graham Faust, and Devin Johnson. I could add Monica Yoon and Laura Sims. One can immediately see on reading them that these poets represent a departure, but exactly how they depart is more difficult to say, because their poems can be in their own way as slippery and oblique as anything by, say, Mattia Harvey, arguably more so. Burt's article asserts that the new poetry, or the new thing, in caps, seeks, as William Carlos Williams did, well-made, attentive, unornamented things. That sounds clear enough, but all of the terms raise questions, at least in my mind. I know from experience that it's not easy to condense a poem. Compression is a form of style, a recognizable form of style, and so maybe a form of ornament in itself. It can produce a beauty effect. The modernists knew this, as did the Shakers. The part of Burt's description I take most seriously is the word attentive. I want my poems, for instance, to be attentive. Attention seems like a virtue in itself, while lack of ornament doesn't necessarily. But how does the quality of attentiveness show itself, or fail to show itself, in a poem? Attentive to what? To the world? To the structure of language? Either or both? Why should the spare, stark poem seem more attentive? Does the space such poems open up allow for questions to resonate inside it? Maybe it works this way. I think things actually get more complicated as we try to reduce them to their simplest forms, their most basic elements. Look what happened to physics. It was when scientists smashed atoms looking for the basic components of nature that they discovered the famous uncertainty principle, the deep ambiguities at the heart of things. But there's nothing like examples. Let's look at some of the poems by practitioners of this new thing and by some of their mentors or predecessors. We'll consider what it means to be attentive, what it means to be stark or simple. So let's start with the objectivist poet, George Oppen, writing here in the 1960s, although he first came on the scene in the 1930s. And this poem is really pretty didactic. It's a kind of poetic statement where he talks about what he values and what he dislikes in poetry, and it's called The Gesture. The question is, how does one hold an apple who likes apples, and how does one handle filth? The question is, how does one hold something in the mind which he intends to grasp, and how does the salesman hold a bauble he intends to sell? The question is, when will there not be 100 poets who mistake that gesture for a style? So that's harsh, maybe scolding. How does one handle filth? I'm not sure. But what I do respond to here is the distinction he makes between the way one treats something one wants to grasp and the way one proffers something one wants to sell. Grasp has two connotations, for me anyway here. You grasp something by beginning to understand it, by thinking it through or writing it through in order to understand. Or you grasp at something physical the way a person in the river might grasp a rope with utter concentration and respect. In either case, the thing to be grasped is meaningful first to oneself, and then perhaps to others. With salesmen, clearly, it is otherwise. The salesman wants to move merchandise, to get it off his hands by making it attractive to a customer. That is its value to him. Oppen states baldly that there are 100, by which of course he means 1,000 or so, poets who are like salesmen. I know what he means intuitively. I've had similar feelings. But again, the issue isn't so simple. Oppen, after all, did intend to be read, so in that sense, he wanted to get his poem off his hands and onto the page and into somebody else's hands. He probably wanted his poem to be remembered. The structure of his poem, the repetition, for instance, of how does, that parallelism, is intended, one might guess, to be memorable, to be pleasing in its way. This is, after all, an argumentative poem, its rhetoric intending to put its point across. He creates a sense of urgency. For me, that sense of urgency is real, but it's also an aesthetic effect. The next poem on the handout is by the new thing's most eminent forebear, William Carlos Williams. I think this is an especially interesting poem of his. So we're going to look at it. It's really more radical, I think, than any of the examples of more recent poems that I have today, including my own. I mean, it's really formally pretty radical. So it's called, I don't know, I didn't type the title on it, but it's called The Locust Tree in Flower. Duh, I don't know how I missed that. But anyway, so I'm going to read it, and you can think about what's the first thing you notice about it. If this was a class, I guess I'd really ask that question. I don't know if I'm going to do that or not. Okay. Among olive green, stiff, old, bright, broken branch come, white, sweet May again. Okay, so there are several things that are unusual about this poem. First, you see the shape, one word per line, long and thin like the branch he refers to. The second thing you notice is more interesting. It begins with two prepositions that don't seem to go with each other very well, among and of. So you're almost asked to choose between those prepositions, because really, how can it be both? We don't know how to place or contextualize whatever will come next. And what does come next? 5 adjectives. William said, no ideas but in things. But here, at least, he's pretty cagey about what a thing is. You have to wait for it. The way the stanzas are grouped further frustrates our attempt to locate the object being described. We arrive, if we ever do, at the thing itself through its veils of somewhat contradictory attributes. It's green, yet old. It's broken and bright. After the list of adjectives, there are further complications because the grammar is odd. Why is it branch, not branches? Something might appear among branches, but not among branch. This stiff old branch is oddly singular. One supposes that the subject noun here, finally, is the month of May, which is the next to last word in the poem. But we don't arrive at it smoothly. Why isn't the verb comes? Surely May comes. Unless Williams wants to put multiple possibilities in play. What if May is a verb here, the beginning of a new sentence? Spring may come again. Something white and sweet may erupt out of that old branch? I won't lead you any further down that possibly problematic path. For me, the interest in this poem is that it seems stripped down, and yet in its very minimalism, it produces more possible readings than elaborated sentences would. Is this poem metaphorical or not? Is it really about the branch of a tree entirely or not? I don't really know, but I like that. Okay, on the next page of the handout, you'll find 3 young poets associated with Burt's new thing, or Silliman's new precisionism: Joseph Massey, Monica Yoon, although Burt didn't really mention her. He told me, though, when we talked about it, because we emailed about this essay back and forth, and he said he didn't mention Monica because they're such good friends. I don't mean, that way, but they're really good friends, and so he felt like it wouldn't really be appropriate for him to be writing about her, which has never stopped some of my friends from writing about me, but it made me glad that I wasn't a better friend of Stephen Burt. But I put Monica in anyway. So we'll start with this little poem by Joseph Massey, which is from his first book, Areas of Fog. He really only has 2 books. The second is Exit North. I think Massey has a terrific eye and a great ear. His best poems are faceted jewels, reminiscent perhaps of Basho. So here's the poem, and it really doesn't have a title, so I didn't leave the title off. Flies, sun-dried, line the windowsill, measure what was summer. So that seems very simple. But it provokes a complex response if you really look at it. It's appealing sonically, that is to your ear, yet what it depicts is really a bit revolting and more than a little sad. So what catches your attention in the first stanza? I think it's the term sun-dried. What things are often described as sun-dried? I'm not going to wait for a response. I'm just going to say tomatoes, right? Tomatoes specifically that you might see in the context of an upscale bistro. We're invited to think of these flies in terms of fine dining. The word sun-dried has that aura of gentrification, which makes it highly ironic in this context. And then what's surprising in the second little stanza? For me, the first thing is that past tense verb. It's not measure summer, it's measure what was summer. Summer's over, and Joe hasn't cleaned up, which I can well believe. He sets up a nostalgic tone common enough to poetry, especially nature poetry, the longing for summers past and gone. But that predictable nostalgia is immediately undercut by the brute fact of flies, and the surprising idea of flies as a kind of measuring rod, sort of a natural yardstick. There's very little that's metaphorical in this poem, despite that. Massey seems to trust the literal meaning of words. That's arguable, but... Then we'll look at Monica Yoon's poem from her second book, Ignatz. The book is called Ignatz, and the poem It's called Ignatz in August. Every poem in her books has the word Ignatz in it. Some of you will recognize that as a name and some won't. Apparently, there was a famous, if not infamous, sort of comic strip by George Harriman in which there were the characters of Crazy Cat and Ignatz Mouse. And you couldn't really tell the gender of these characters, but Crazy Cat didn't so much want to eat Ignatz Mouse as had an obsessive love for Ignatz Mouse, was kind of an abject lover of Ignatz. And Ignatz was anything ranging from dismissive to violent towards Crazy Cat. So Ignatz becomes throughout the book a kind of symbol of, that little understood but obsessive object of desire that sometimes we tend to have. An unattainable and perverse love. This too this one is a kind of nature poem, I suppose. Ignatz in August. You arch up off me, sweat flowers white out of my every desert pore. So that's a pretty poem. The tone is serious and romantic. We don't see cartoon characters, except if you read the whole book, you know about the comic book characters. But we do have to ask who you are and who I am here. And this is precisely what Yoon wants us to do throughout the book. Beyond that, we have to wonder what is metaphorical here and what isn't. Is the speaker a woman whose lover has just left her, or a desert after an August thunderstorm? Think of it first one way, then the other. Which is metaphorical, the sweat or the flowers? The desert or the skin with its pores? If this is a pretty way to talk about sweat, why is it white? My sweat isn't white. I don't know about yours. All the terms in this apparently simple and attentive poem are, in fact, unstable, as they were in the poem by Williams, and I find that interesting. The next poem is by the person who might be the poster boy of this new precisionism, Graham Faust. Oh, God, I think this was from his first book, but now I'm not positive. Which might have been called As in Every Deafness. Anyway, Night Train. Creased. The darkness seems exactly the same. Someone in one of those houses is you. So, what's the first thing we wonder about this poem? I like to start with questions like that when I teach. In my case, the title, of course, made me wonder whether this was going to be about a passing train passing through a town at night, or a night spent drinking cheap wine intended to get one blotto, because there is cheap wine, sold basically to alcoholics called Night Train, or at least there was. I don't know if it still exists, but I think it probably does. We can't tell, and we find it doesn't matter. Difference makes no difference at all. That's the sense this nihilistic little poem expertly conveys. The darkness before and after the train passes are indistinguishable. And, disturbingly, in the second half of the poem, you, that special someone, or you, the reader, are lost in a distanced view of duplicate houses. Someone and anyone are confused with one another. The language of this poem is indeed plain and stark. The only word that lends itself to metaphor is the important beginning word, creased. But even that becomes literalized formally. It's worth noting at this point that the two halves of the poem, divided by the hyphens crease, are structurally very similar, though not identical. Each section is composed of a two-line stanza above a one-line stanza. The single line in both cases is composed of two words. A hyphen separates the two sections as a ghost crease separates yet fails to separate the times before and after the train's passage. And then, if you turn the page, I've got another poem about trains by the woman who was the poet laureate until just very recently, Kay Ryan. Kay Ryan I only heard of Kay Ryan for the first time, well, maybe in that, maybe in an essay, in fact, by Stephen Burt, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, can't remember. But she's not young, but she kind of came out of nowhere and became quite eminent quite quickly. I don't think she's a natural fit. She's not a perfect fit with this new precisionism, and yet there's some ways in which you can read her that way. We can talk after we look at the poem about how she might or might not be a fit into this new thing. Trutrac Figure. Imagine a train-track figure made of silver over silver of between-car vision, each slice too brief to add detail or deepen. That could be a hat, if it's a person, if it's a person, if it's a person. Just the same scant information, time to supplant the same scant information. That's one of my favorite of her poems, actually. I don't like them all, but I do like that one. So I'm not sure exactly what her influences are, or if she would claim Williams, for instance, as an influence. Marianne Moore comes to mind as a possible reference point for her. These poems are, to use Burt's phrase, well-made and relatively unornamented, unless metaphor is equated with ornament, which it might be. But they're not like Williams or like Massey, attentive to whatever happens to happen. Happenstance doesn't come into it. Her poems are not based on observation, they're idea-driven. That's the difference. The ideas are wedded to metaphor. You can imagine what she's depicting, right? The way I see it, and you can, if you have the handout, you'll be able to follow me better. But you're looking at something on the far side of a passing train, and you can only see it in glimpses too brief to make sense of it. The same glimpse again and again. You know, if it's a person, if it's a person, if it's a person, which catches the rhythm of the train passing over the tracks. It's the same glimpse again and again, but the repetition doesn't really help you understand what you're seeing. Now, do you think that she's interested in this phenomenon itself? I don't know, but I guess that the answer is no. The image is a vehicle, so to speak, of a metaphor. She's interested in helping us visualize something else. So we have to think, what is she really talking about? And again, it's more helpful if you're looking at it. But you get just the same scant information, time to supplant the same scant information. I would think that she's talking about the news cycle. That's my guess. And I sort of like it for that, you know, that we get the same glimpse over and over of something, but not enough information to deepen, right, or to add detail. She's right about that, I think, and this is a very clever way to present the idea, or should I say smart. In my hesitating between the word clever and smart, you can hear my ambivalence, I think. She's using the train to now hark back to the Oppen poem to sell you her idea. And that generally puts me off, but here I kind of like it, so I guess I'm not all that predictable. Still, the metaphors that I like the best are the ones that are unstable, that may be there and may not, that shimmer, that are sort of like desert mirages. Those are the metaphors I like. You know, was Williams talking about something more sexual, say, than just a branch of a tree? Was Monica Yoon talking about a woman or the desert? Those are the things that intrigue me. But anyway, enough about Kay Ryan. Of course, I'm here to talk about myself by talking about what I like. So how can I say what I like in a nutshell? Well, one thing is that I like poems that are both plain and slippery. Is that asking for too much? Is it asking for the moon? People sometimes say you're asking for the moon if you're asking for the impossible. And that's a phrase in the poem of my own that I'm going to read first. This poem is from my first book. And back then I was more of a minimalist, and I didn't put the name of my poem either. Duh, but it's called View. Not the city lights. We want the moon. The moon. None of our own doing. I'm not going to go on and on explaining my poems because to me it always seems like bad taste, you know. I let other people do it or not do it. But I will say that this poem depends on double meanings and a kind of double hearing. It asks you to hear and then rehear two common phrases, wanting the moon and also that wasn't my doing. When people say the latter, they're generally trying to cover something up. Anyway, okay. I'm going to move on to my next poem. I'm going to say I'm not a true minimalist anymore, or an imagist anymore, though that aesthetic still plays a part in my work. My poems have gotten, overall, more complicated. Now they often play the concrete off against the abstract, and they often come in separate sections that are more or less indirectly related. I chose to reproduce this poem, A Resemblance, because it examines the psychology, if you will, around two common poetic devices, the image and the metaphor. And at this point, I guess I should read the poem, if I can find it. A resemblance. As a word is mostly connotation, matter is mostly aura, halo, the same loneliness that separates me from what I call the world. Quiet, ragged skirt of dust encircling a ceramic gourd. Lookalikes. Are you happy now? Would I like a vicarious happiness? Yes, though I suspect yours of being defective, forced. The only image, really, in this poem is in the second section. That section also contains two metaphors. The thing depicted, the ceramic gourd, is a kind of pre-made metaphor. That is, some artisan made a ceramic piece that resembled a gourd. And then there was the metaphor made by me, that is calling the dust around the gourd a skirt, which is a rather simple, humble metaphor. For some reason, we poets, and actually we all humans, I think, like comparisons. We like pairs, lookalikes, I call them in the poem. We like replacing one thing with another, seeing one thing in terms of another. That's how we understand, right? Or we think we like it, but we're fickle. And replacement isn't always benign, is it? Well, I'll leave you to think that over, and I guess I'm going to end there. I don't know how much time I took. Ooh, well, I did take more than 10 minutes. Does anyone want to say something or ask questions? Are we supposed to be doing that, the Q&A thing? Okay. Does anybody want to ask any questions about anything on my handout, or anything about that I've said about the essay, or, yeah?
Sorry if this is too technical, but in your poem View, I'm curious as to why you chose to lay it out on the page like you did, because I've noticed that's something that you've more or less
given up. Yeah. That's a good question, but it's not really a question that I can answer, because it's asking me to put myself back into myself in 1977. And that self is almost as much of a stranger to me as you are. So I guess maybe I was somewhat influenced a little bit by concrete poetry. I did read, Basho and Issa and such. Williams may have done some things with staggering lines. Yeah, it's something I don't do as much anymore, although I did just recently write a poem that has various margins, and they kind of represent different speakers and voices. But that's not exactly what's going on here. Good question, no answer. Anybody else want to try that? Yes?
I read an interview of yours that you quoted somebody saying that a poem should not mean, but it should be.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, there was I think it was even like a poem in itself. Archibald MacLeish was one of the modernists. A poem should not mean but be, right? Okay. But I interrupted you. What's the question?
Can you elaborate on that more, like what that difference means?
Oh, I used that in a satirically in a poem that hasn't been published in a book yet. It was, maybe you saw it because it was in Poetry Magazine. I'm going to read it at the reading. It's called Soft Money, and I do a riff off of that. But what you want me to tell you what Archibald MacLeish meant by it? Okay. Well, I think he meant that poems are artworks. They're embodiments. You know, they're not lectures, and they're not all about what they mean. And if you can, if you can paraphrase, if you could, an Emily Dickinson poem, you would probably end up with something very, very long and nowhere near as interesting as her poem. So I think he meant something like that, which is, I guess, really very few people would disagree with. Yes?
When did you begin to write?
Like in kindergarten, because my mother read poetry to me, which was lucky for me, I guess, or else it was terrible for me, I don't know which. And then I had a teacher in kindergarten who liked poetry, and she had all of us making up little poems, and then she would write them down for us and make a mimeograph sheet of them. And so I just kind of, I always took to it. I don't think I wrote my first poem that I kept until I was 22, but, I was always going in that direction, running off that cliff. It's just lately it's started to be good to me, but in general I wouldn't recommend poetry as a life. But anyway, yeah. But anybody else? Come on, somebody else wonders something about one of the poems that I read, maybe? Anybody want to disagree about one of the poems I read? Yeah.
I'm wondering why reading through poems mentioned in the New Thing essay by Stephen Burt and the ones that you've included in the packet, why writers of this kind of trend tend to exclude punctuation at the end of their pieces. I know that's kind of a weird technical thing, but...
Well, let me see. Okay, Oppen has a period, Williams doesn't. Massey doesn't, Yoon doesn't, you're right, Faust doesn't. Ryan does, I have an exclamation point in the first one, but no punctuation in the second one. I don't often, because sometimes I want to give the sense that the thought isn't finished, that the thinking process could go on, in order to encourage the reader, I guess, to keep thinking what might be said next. I can't speak for these other people. Bert thinks that the younger ones are imitating me, but I don't know if that's true or not. No clue. I could only speak for myself. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about how living in San Diego has impacted your work or identity as a poet?
I get asked that question, so I have to think about it sometimes. I did live in the Bay Area for a long time, and I think if I hadn't lived in the Bay Area, I probably would not have gone on to have the career that I've had, even though I only lived there for 10 years. I went to Berkeley, then I went back to San Diego, then I went up to San Francisco, went to San Francisco State, and then just hung around, for a long time, or a number of years. And that's where I did my apprenticeship, not so much at the schools as just on the scene, And so by the time I came back to San Diego, I already had connections, which back before the internet was, you had to go to a scene to make any connections. And, in San Francisco then we had we saw each other a lot. There were a lot of readings, a lot of talks, intense interactions that got a lot of things going. So that is also a part of my career. But I think it wasn't bad for me to leave that and come back to San Diego when I did. Somehow. There was something, when I got back to San Diego, it seemed very, very quiet. I mean, it wasn't literally quiet because I was living kind of under a flight path. But, in terms of, the Dickinson poem where she says, differ if they do as syllable from sound, or there were sounds, but there weren't many syllables happening in my life then. And so there was this great sense of silence that fell. And that was kind of provocative in a way and interesting, and I started to kind of write into that sort of silence. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I don't know what direction my poetry would have taken if I had stayed in San Francisco. So that's answer number one. Answer number two is, I think growing up in Southern California, and the same would be true of Orange or LA or whatever, we are all, we all were prepared to be Baudrillard. We all knew about, the simulacrum, right? But, he was a French guy who came over and discovered it. Oh, Disneyland, but we already knew all about that, So we just didn't happen to write that essay. So there's a kind of natural irony, I think, that comes from being a Southern Californian. And in San Diego, at least, you've got the massive presence of the military and then the kind of theme park tourist reality brushing up against each other. So that there's a kind of dissonance that's pretty visible. That probably influenced me. And then answer number three, which is the least interesting, is that I think a lot of the flora of Southern California, and it might as well be Orange as San Diego, again, no difference, kind of comes into my work just because I do tend to look outside and start from what I see. So, could be cars and palm trees. Often is. So I guess that's all I have to say about that. Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the notion of slipperiness that you talked about. I definitely see in modernist texts a kind of destabilization, but it also makes me think of Cubism. And so like a kind of tension between taking apart and then sort of veering towards assembling something. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that, like if Cubism is
Well, I think that Cubism was very important to the modernists. I mean, especially Gertrude Stein was tremendously influenced, as everyone knows, by Cubism.
I'm thinking even of like Williams and works like Spring and all.
Yeah. And I think that one aspect of language poetry, people usually ask me, what does it mean to be a language poet? And I think we're actually all very different writers, but one thing that we do seem to have in common, and maybe it fits into what you're saying, is this idea that the parts, maybe it's sentences, maybe it's stanzas, whatever, don't have to be directly related. They can be tangentially related. They might be remixed in a different order. They're sort of modular. And that's a little bit like Cubism, too, I guess. Yeah.
You mentioned the internet, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how that has shifted the poetry scene so that you don't have to be in San Francisco to be part of a scene, whether it's blogs or Facebook or whatever. And then the other sort of branch of that, the possible shift from the print book to electronic presentation of poetry.
Oh, God. I have to say, but I'm not a young person. Somebody gave me a Kindle for Christmas and I returned it. So I just don't, I know you can probably get anything onto a Kindle if you can like Napster stuff, but the stuff that I could buy at the Kindle store, I didn't want to read. Other than the New York Times, Maybe the time will come, maybe, when you can get Graham Faust's new book on Kindle, but that time has not yet arrived. So I don't know. I'm a little worried about the funnel that, obviously you can read anything on the internet, and there's no funneling process at all like there is on ebooks. But then that too is kind of discouraging because there is such a wilderness of text on the internet. I don't know. I guess people do communicate a lot. I mostly communicate with the friends that I made face to face. So that's great because now we can be at different cities and we can still be. I actually exchanged 4 emails in real time, like we were texting, but we weren't, with Ron Silliman between 9:30 and 10 o'clock Pacific time last night. He stays up late because he's on the East Coast. So there is that, but in terms of, I don't know, you have to ask really and you probably know the answer better than I do, what it's like to be in Nebraska and be a young poet. I mean, even Southern California doesn't quite count. Maybe it does, but okay. So you're out on the prairies and you're a young poet and you have a computer. Where do you start? I think it's kind of like if you go into a bookstore. Now I'm just going to sound like an old fart, but I'm just going to say it. You go into a bookstore, you pick things up, you look at them, you kind of, first of all, you know what kind of bookstore you're going to. There's this bookstore in town and it's kind of alt somehow, it's got a hip reputation. So you go there. And I don't know, they don't have a great selection, but you find some good stuff, and you look at it, and, it's got one or two books that are just really different, and you buy one, and you start there. Whether it works out well on the internet, I don't know. I mean, really, seriously, somebody could tell me, because people ask me this question, and that's just not how it is for me, because I was already a formed person by the time I got the internet. I mean, I'm glad I have it, but it wasn't formative for me. But so, I mean, we can talk later about all of that, and you guys can tell me what the truth is. Because I don't know. All right, yes.
In reading your work, I get the sense that thoughts or images exist somewhere out there and is not kind of connected or held down by the poet. And I wonder, do you consciously take yourself out of your work?
I think I understand what you're saying, that my work doesn't have an obvious autobiographical frame. Sometimes there are, not really in the two poems that I brought, but if you've read more of my work, or if you come to my reading, there are poems of mine that have things that happen to me in them, and that have bits of my life in them. But I tend to kind of put that material on a par with other material. It is no more emphasized than something I saw or something I heard on television. It's juxtaposed with it kind of on an equal footing. And it doesn't read like a story. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn things about me from reading my poetry. I mean, I think if you read versed, at some point you get the feeling that I had cancer, which I did, or that I was sick at least. And I mean, I really write about whatever I'm thinking about. And if that means I'm thinking about disease, then disease comes into it. I'm just not constructing it as an autobiography. I mean, here's my feeling. Who really thinks, now I'm walking along. Here I go sitting down. I mean, I just don't do that part. I just talk about what I'm seeing once I sat down, I just skip to the good parts. That's the way I see it. That's the way I see it. So I don't create myself as a character. I'm not against fiction. I think of that as fiction. I'm not against fiction. I'm reading Jonathan Franzen's novel right now, Freedom with Enjoyment. But it's just, not all poets do that. Some do and some don't. But that doesn't mean there's none of me in it. I mean, for instance, when my son was little, he watched a lot of cartoons, and I would watch cartoons with him because I wanted to be doing what he was doing. So instead of being a real parent, I turned into a kid. And we would laugh about cartoons, which meant that cartoon characters came into my work. Now, no cartoon characters, So my circumstances, put it that way, my circumstances affect my work, and that means my life affects my work. It's just that I'm not going, yo, these are my circumstances, now here they go. That's all. They come in when they come in. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's just how I am. Okay, anybody else? Yeah.
Would you speak to the process that you've mentioned, I forget where it was, I read it online, about carrying a blank book and just picking up pieces, and then also sometimes not being able to complete it and having to wait for it?
Yeah. I very seldom complete something at one sitting. It has happened, but, the times it's happened I could count on probably both hands. And I like not doing. I like not completing something in one. Yeah, because I like different perspectives to come in, and you're going to feel a little differently 3 days later. And I like to get that kind of range of ideas and feelings and events to juxtapose together. I just like that texture. Think of it as jump cuts or whatever is familiar to you. But yeah, I do carry a blank book. I left it in Logan's car, but I've got it with me. Had it on the train. Didn't write anything in it because I was too busy reading Franzen. But just in case, it was with me. It is with me almost at all times. Just in case, you know, you never know. And so I am a bit of a magpie. Things that I hear that sound really strange and interesting to me, I'll write down. So, okay, yeah.
You mentioned Franzen, it made me wonder to what extent you read a lot of other works, and particularly poets' works, and if you feel that that's overly influential or just fine to keep.
I try to keep up. See, I'm reading new poets. Look. Yeah, I try to keep up with what's being published, and I do read a lot of poetry. And I don't read a lot of contemporary fiction. That's kind of different for me. I mean, there are some, I liked W.G. Sebald a lot. He's not contemporary anymore, sadly, since he died. I like Ishiguro, if I'm saying his name correctly. I like Lydia Davis very much. But I don't read a lot of contemporary fiction. I'm just giving Franzen a try. I read a lot of, I don't know why anyone would care about this. I read a lot of classic 19th century fiction, you know. I just read pretty much all of Trollope. I got on a Trollope kick. I had missed him in college, and I went, wow, what a pleasure that was. I read science stuff because I'm interested in it. So I will read books about, I mean, I'm no expert, so I'm not trying to present myself with any sort of expertise. These books are popular books, you know, like Brian Greene, but it's not just always physics. I'll read about theories of consciousness and cognitive science, and I almost always read Scientific American and Discover Magazine and that kind of stuff. I seem to get a lot of inspiration from that somehow. I even talked a real actual physicist into having lunch with me recently so we could talk about physics. I'm not sure we had a meeting of minds, but so I'm kind of a science groupie. That kind of describes my reading. We can be finished if nobody else has a question. All right. Okay. Thank you for coming.